afternoon and welcome to Lunchtime series where we add value to people's lives, happening every week on ebizradio.com. You can catch the Lunchtime series on all major podcast channels today. If you want to help climate change, Clean Creatives is calling on all agencies, PR companies and individual creatives to stop working with fossil fuel industry and brands to stop working with the agencies that continue to do so. Sign the pledge and find out more at cleancreatives.org/South Africa. Clean Creatives, the future of creativity is clean. Conversation what we're going to have in our coaching segment today, guys, is why we need more leaders to step into a coaching role. And one of the things that stands out for me straight off the bat is, according to the International Personal Management Association and the ICF, the International Coaching Federation, some of the stats that they have is 98% of executives felt that investment for a coach was worth it. 85% of executives needed someone to listen to, and 78% of executives required coaching for motivation. And I wanted someone to join me on this conversation and who's going to be joining me on a regular month-to-month basis. None other than a wonderful human and talent-centered strategist. She's an executive coach. She's also an agile people advocate and an HR and leadership expert, Anja van Beek. Anja, welcome to the Lunchtime segment.
Oh, lovely to be back, Kevin. Thank you for the invitation. And this is a topic that I'm so passionate about, so I can't wait for our conversation today.
Absolutely. For me as well, I think as doing what we do and coming from the environments that we do, we see the benefits of what coaching does for us and what it has done for our lives. So, invariably we've stepped into that role and we kind of go, this is why this is so important. But, one of the very, very specific things, and stepping straight into it, the reason why coaching is so important, or leaders need to step into that coaching role, is because it does offer customized, individualized communication. And for me, especially coming from a neurolinguistics perspective, it's so important. We often find that, language, how we language information, we take it for granted. We do the usual way of business, and yet we look past the way that we actually language information, right? I look at one of the current projects I work on in just with regards to biases, and how very often we make generalized conversation about those people or that team. Right. And immediately, the association that you have with making a generalization like that really puts you in a position where you're not even doing it consciously, but subconsciously you're judging, right? You're making a judgment call because that team, when that team does their thing, they always get out of hand, or I'm not good with that team. People, and you kind of go, okay, so what are you languaging every time you're using that information? A simple thing like languaging no, right? I was sitting in a conversation with my brother. I just actually used this reference earlier today as well. And every time he started a conversation, he would go, no, but and he carried on talking. And eventually I stopped him. I said, do you realize that you start conversations with no? Right. So, when it comes to stepping into why the benefits of coaching and having leaders step into a bit of a coaching role and really understanding fundamentals of what coaching really is, right, is being able to customize individualized communication. And I think, it's so important for leaders to start showing up. We can't afford to not. Right.
Yeah,
we live in an agile world, and it's such a big world in the moment that's changing.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to say absolutely. I can't agree with you more. And I mean, I've once read a post on LinkedIn where someone, quite a big influence, I'm not going to name the individual, but said that, they hate the idea that we actually advocate leaders to have a coaching approach. And I actually comment on that to say, I totally disagree with you. I have a different view simply because where we find ourselves. I mean, if we just reflect, and we're not going to go into detail, but just over the last 2 years, what has happened? And that's why I like the way that you language it about How do you communicate with whoever is sitting in front of you? And when I think of a leader as a coach, it's about being very intentional about looking for moments to grow whoever is sitting or you interacting with. Because often people think, yes, leaders as coaches, let's wait for the performance review, let's wait for our monthly check-in, and then I will provide feedback. And putting on a coaching approach is actually the difference between I'm giving you an instruction and I'm asking you a powerful question, open-ended question, for you to figure it out ourselves. Because, I mean, if you think of majority of us working with knowledge workers, and knowledge workers, you appointed them for a very specific reason, either their experience or their the qualities, the talents that they bring to the role, and now you instruct them. And I think for leaders as coaches, even though they might not necessarily understand that, you were talking about unconscious habits, but we have so many unconscious habits that is actually hindering us, even though you might have a good intent. I'm smiling now as I'm saying that I'm currently running a workshop, Leaders as Coaches, and one of the leaders, we're doing a role play where we say, okay, what's the business issue? Let's coach the person on it. And it's amazing to see how many of us even though we don't want to, still give advice. And you just mask the advice with a question. And I think that is why it's so relevant. If you have a look at so many different leadership styles, we know that the autocratic style is not relevant. We know that we can't have those traditional ways of leading that was popular many years ago. Today is a different approach. And I'm a firm believer that the coaching approach is something that more people need to embrace. And not saying that's the only approach. I mean, definitely there might be situations where a directive or a more direct approach is needed. But I almost want to say how often, or have a look at how often can you put on that coaching hat as a leader?
Yeah, I love the fact that you started this conversation and you specifically mentioned intentional, right? When you are intentional, and I think a lot of the time, and that's where we come back to self-awareness, right? Well, what is my intention in this moment? What is the outcome that I seek to have with this individual? When you are intentional, even the nonverbal communication, even that changes. Yeah. So really stepping into that coaching role, I think is really important just from that intentional perspective. Another thing that I think really benefits leadership from stepping into that coaching role is focus specifics and measurable processes. Often, people leave things quite vague and ambiguous, and I think from a coach's perspective, I always, when I do my presentation to anyone and I do training, I present it as kick-ass Kevin. So I like I'm kick-ass Kevin, and I do that intentionally because if you want a certain and I when I say it, it sounds strong, or it sounds wrong in a way. But if you want a wine, get yourself some cheese and a bottle of wine and go and do it somewhere. Stepping into coach role is very specifically what is the problem, what is the challenge that you have, and what is the action you're taking, right? And I think that's the very fine line between what people where coaches step into the role of, no, we're actually, this is a coaching process and it's results driven. People, they need an actual process to understand, okay, this is what I'm going to do and this is how we're going to get there. And if you're not sure, I'm going to hold your hand, I'll be there, but I need you to take action. And I think action processes to support your employees is so important, because it's not just a case of going, okay, cool, this is what we're doing and let's see how we get there. There has to be small deliverables, whether that be micro behaviors or complete processes that need to be put in place, but there must be action involved in a coaching process because it gets results.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is why you word the word measurable. And I think that is critical because for any coaching session, I mean, to be clear on what is the outcome that we want to achieve or what's the outcome that you want to achieve. Because, I mean, if I'm coaching you, it's about you. It's not about my agenda. But to be very clear on how do we measure that? Because otherwise, and I think sometimes that is why people might have a bad connectivity, is that we're not clear on how are we going to measure success or what will success look like, or after this interaction, what are you walking away with? Or at least, as you said, what's the action? What's my next step? Or at least what's the learning that I got? But I agree with you. It's so important to think of, let's start off and be clear on what's the goal or what's the measurement? Or, what does that look like? Absolutely. And I actually, when you mentioned that, what comes to mind for me is that I almost want the listeners today to start to think of, I want to ask them two questions. So when I want you to consider when you as a leader are under pressure and someone comes in and asks you a question, what is your habit? What do you do in that moment? So you under pressure, you sitting, you busy with a, I don't know, hectic strategy document that needs to be submitted, and they come and they enter and they ask you a question. What is your immediate reaction? So that's the first question that I want them to consider. And secondly, opposite role. So let's say your team members are under pressure for whatever reason. How does your behavior change in that moment? So you might not be the one that's under pressure, but they are. And again, thinking with the coaching hat on, how does that change? So I don't know if you want to reflect on that. If you're under pressure, what is your habits? What do you normally do if you think of the times when you were managing a team?
For me, it's usually I need a immediate behavior is to I stress for about 5 minutes, and I know thought really affects behavior. So I stress for about 5 minutes and I kind of go, okay, cool. I can't stay here for very long. So I freak out. I'll have a little freak out. And that could be from like running around or like phoning or like speaking or having a glass of wine or whatever I need.
Yeah.
And then I realize, okay, cool. You've had your moment. Stop. What is the next best option here? Yeah. And it's really just noticing, and it's usually having the cognizance of the feeling that's being created by the panic. Yeah. Because very often people ignore that, right? From a coaching perspective, you can't, avoiding an emotion is the worst thing, right? And we've learned it in so many references that emotions are there as indicators of something is happening. Emotions are beautiful. The moment you actually connect to them and kind of go, oh, I really am triggered by this, and this is interesting, and become curious of my emotion rather than just kind of going, oh, I don't want to deal with this, right? Yeah. Because then you're also framing what's happening in the moment differently. And I think framing in itself, as a leader, it is so important to put it in context. Yeah. And contextualize what is happening, because we often, the content and the context of the situation can really make or break the situation itself, Yeah. So I think I freak out and then I come and go, okay, cool. What's my next best thing to do here?
Yeah, and I'm smiling as you answer because I know I can hear exactly, or you have so much self-awareness. And I think what I often hear from leaders, and they might not necessarily have that exposure to, okay, let me understand what's happening in the moment. But what I see them often do is in that moment where they are under stress, is they just want to control the situation, and they almost, without realizing it, go into problem solving mode, or go into, okay, this is what we're going to do, that's how we're going to solve it. Or other way around, if the team are under pressure, to come in and say, okay, how can I support you? So I often see leaders either taking on the work themselves and just say, leave it with me, I will do it. I mean, that saying of, I'm the best best person to finish the job, or let me support you. And I think that's the first thing that I want leaders to be aware of what's that habit. You don't even think about it, but either taking control or giving advice. And that's the first step into taking the coaching approach, is to start to be aware of these on controlling habits, I want to say.
Another frame I like that I love using as well is, especially from a linguistics perspective, Anja, is when someone comes to you with a problem and says, "I have a problem," and you say, "Okay, can you teach me how to have your problem?"
Yeah.
And the moment you have to teach someone how to have your problem, you realize that you're going, "Oh, this is my problem, and I have a problem because of X, Y, and Z."
Yeah.
Because then it also frames the how you have your problem. And very often when you just say, "I have a problem," you're not even noticing that you're saying, I have a problem. So what I'm hearing you say is, you have a problem. So teach me how you're having your problem. And at the moment when someone is like, "What do you mean teach me how am I having this problem?" It's like, well, it's your problem. If you can teach me how you're having the problem, you'll understand more about your problem.
Yeah.
You know? And just having a frame around understanding how people language information like that, again, it's just a useful technique to, like, really get them to think about, I have a problem, right?
And when you mention that, what comes to mind is, for me as well, is, again, just as you say, small language about the we versus the I. Now, as a leader, as a coach, we often want to say, what are we going to do about this? Or how can we solve it? And I mean, it's good. It shows that you're here to back them. But when in that moment, when you have your coaching hat on, as you say, what will you say, or what will you do different? And it's something very small, but it will actually make such a big impact.
Another one that I think is really important to mention is deep and fundamental changes in behaviors, right? Helping individuals identify their micro behaviors and what could potentially be the root cause of their behaviors. And one of the things that we often do in the training, when I'm doing any kind of training intervention, coaching intervention, one of the things that we live by, as especially from an NLP perspective, is intention does not equal or necessarily equal behavior. Right. And what I intended to do doesn't necessarily equal what my behavior is showing up as. So when we look at that, you kind of have to say, I'm experiencing behavior and people are behaving a certain way. They are not their behavior. They are behaving a certain way. But what we generally do is we coin it and we kind of go, okay, those people are behaving like that. It means that they are those kinds of people. And what we know is people are not they are not their behavior. They are showcasing behavior. You don't know what the intention of the behavior is, right? So from a coach's perspective, again, if leaders can take a moment to step back and kind of go, I wonder what the intention here of that behavior is, because I'm not understanding the behavior. And when I'm coming from that perspective, I'm also not judging the behavior. I'm trying to understand the behavior. And I think it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to emphasize what you've said is that the words that I use is non-judgmental, because I think for us leaders as coaches, we so often faced with have to deal with the situation. Is it right or wrong? Is it good or bad? And in that coaching approach, it's critical to have that non-judgment or judgmental approach. And I think if they say, yes, but it happens, I'm human, just remember the word curious. Like you said, let me remain curious and think a little bit different, because I'm smiling now that you said that. I actually had a session with a group yesterday, and we were talking exactly about this, is that we showed a video and we had a look at a guy that they thought were angry and accusatory. And when we unpack that, we actually went back to, okay, but let's be clear on what did you see or hear? Oh, I saw him slamming down his iPhone. Okay, that's what you saw. And now your conclusion, as you said, is, he's angry or he's accusatory. So I love the way that you mentioned it. Let's just remain curious and see, but why would they behave like that? What might the alternative be than just labeling it as I'm angry or he's angry? And absolutely.
Also, the last thing I want to mention is to this point is we call it the reticular activation system, and I often mention it in many kind of conversations. But your RAS, it's a beautiful little gland behind your eyes that are there, and where your brain focuses is your brain sort of pays attention and finds supporting evidence to prove the thing that's real, right? And that's why, as a leader, it is so important to have context and content and be in observation and curious about it, coming from that perspective, because we instinctively, our brains are designed to keep us safe, right? So we instinctively kind of go with the very first thing that comes like right in front of us. And when you're stepping into that coach's perspective and you show up as a different leader, you would step back and kind of look at it from an objective perspective and look at what is the content, what is the context, because your RAS, we often refer to as your RAS will kick your ass, right? Because since you get so caught up with the problem that you're so focused on the thing that you're busy with, that you don't see the wood beyond the trees kind of thing. And be careful on focusing on the minutiae of and the minute detail of the problem, and rather, step back, take a breather, recalibrate yourself and take a different stance, because your ass will kick your ass, basically.
Yeah, I love that. I've never heard that, so that's something that I will take away. The Raz kicking my ass, and I think in that moment where leaders want to have the coaching approach. I mean, for those of the leaders listening today that does not have had the luxury of, doing some training, I think you don't. It might feel vague, but think of coaching in that moment. And I mean, I know it's a very, it's not an older approach, but it's a very familiar approach. But just think of the GROW model. I mean, what's the goal? Yeah. What's the reality? What are my opportunities, and what will I do going forward? So sometimes it's just thinking of, okay, what if the situation recalls a different level of thinking? You know what they say, a problem can't be solved with the same thinking. So let me just elevate the thinking of my team member or my colleague or whatever by asking a specific question. And I think that's the practical tip. When you think even of asking questions, people say, but why do you need to share or talk to us about questions? But I mean, once you start taking note of how many questions do you ask, that is either a statement because you have a specific idea of what you want to achieve, or as I said earlier on, just masking it with, I'm now taking it in a question, versus asking a question that really allow the person to explore an alternative. So if it might be that I'm complaining about those people or the team, what question can I ask to, I almost want to say, alleviate their thinking process, because that's what you want to do. You want them to start thinking. And again, leaders as coaches, I don't know if you can relate to that, Kevin, but usually for us, when we ask a question, we're sometimes so uncomfortable with that silence, even if it's a few seconds. And I mean, for leaders to just be comfortable with that few seconds of silence, because once you ask the question, sit back, keep quiet, and allow the guy to think. Because so often we want to, fill the silence and ask a follow-up question or start answering the question or whatever. And I think it's, again, getting used with that discomfort of ask, think, and let's share with me what comes to mind for you.
And also, Anja, I want to preface as well that I think a coach isn't there to give advice.
Not at all.
And we so often as leaders want to fill in the gaps for people.
Yeah.
But when you step into a coach quite specifically, and especially when you're the leader and you have a team of people, you have such pure potential sitting in front of you. All you need to do is to understand, we call it, like we frame it from my coaching model, is the map of your world. Let me understand your map of your world. And if I ask and elicit enough information out of your head, I can understand what's happening in your map and what your map is doing for you and why you show up the way you do. And that's why you say this, asking that crucial question even if there's silence, and you just wait for them to try and find the answer, because essentially then you don't want to go give an advice, because then you're coming from your map.
Exactly.
And my map is not your map, and my map could be very skewed, could be very one-dimensional, or very biased in whatever way. Understand that when you're asking a strategic question, you're actually eliciting information in a way that they probably haven't heard it before. So I think, when a coach is or a leader, and I'm getting them like really close together here, when the leader steps into that coach role, having that strategic question leads them to the potential possibility of information they didn't even know they could uncover.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's beautiful about leaders really using coaching as a strategic tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you mention that, what comes to mind for me as well is I almost want to call it one of my favorite questions. And it's usually a tip that I give the leader is, now that you've asked that strategic question, you've allowed them, you can see they're looking, thinking, and then they respond in a specific way. And it might be a wonderful answer, or it might be that you see they have you've thought about that. But then just simply to ask, and what else? Because so often people give a response, and then if you just say simply, and what else? Let me just go and have a look. What else is there for me to consider? So again, it's something so simple, but for leaders to know that when you put on that coaching hat, it doesn't need to be anything actually different to what you would have done. Just remember, as you say, non-judgmental, don't give advice. And I think being present in the moment, because when I'm saying being present in the moment, it's almost that active listening that comes into play as well. And often, think of I can speak for myself, is when I'm present, I'm actively listening, as you say, looking at your nonverbals, looking at what the words that you choose, but also what is the body language saying. And just paying attention, non-judgmental, sometimes for leaders is challenging, because we're living in this fast-paced world, and I don't have time for this now, I have so many other things. But just pause and focus on who's sitting in front of you and supporting them to discover and grow by asking those questions.
Additional, I want to just add to your question as well, because sometimes people go, I don't know. You say, like, so what do you think it is? And they go, I don't know. Yeah. A beautiful frame for them is, what if you did know, or what could you imagine it to be? Because suddenly when you ask them to imagine it, they don't come from their map, they come from an imaginary place, and suddenly you're literally getting information from a position or a place that they didn't think they could go to. So absolutely, I love that. I think, and and what else is such a a good way of getting them to divulge, and like what else, because it really gets them to open up and speak. And it's beautiful. Anja, so in conclusion, what do you want to share with the leaders out there, and why stepping into a coaching role is so vitally important in today's workforce?
So I think a few thoughts. So I think it's a non-negotiable. If you want your people to thrive, you need to empower them. And we empower people by allowing them to think for themselves. How do we allow them to think for themselves? Is putting on this coaching hat. And again, I think perhaps just remember, look intentionally for moments to coach. Don't wait for the one-on-one. It can happen after a meeting. It can happen after a sales call with someone or whatever. So just be intentional to look for those small coaching moments, and then almost give yourself permission to be a clumsy coach, because it might not come natural to you, but resist the temptation of giving advice. Rather, as you say, ask that question and let them explore. So I think for us, if we think of really have that competitive edge, it is about the people in the business. And if we can support the people to develop and to grow and think for themselves, that is what coaching will allow. And I think the last thing perhaps to say is that don't end the conversation without either being very clear on what's the next steps, what is my next action, and and or what did I learn? What was something that I will take away moving forward? So I think also be very clear on what is the value or the next steps. What have we agreed on doing? Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that. I couldn't have said it better. I just want to add, guys, to that conversation, careful where your RAS is focused, because your RAS will kick your ass.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kevin. It was lovely having this conversation with you.
Yes, thank you. And guys, just as a reminder, Anja and I will be back on a month-to-month basis. We're going to be chatting about various conversations. I think our next one is going to be biases, right, Anja? We're going to talk about biases. We have had this conversation before, but I know that because of your background, there's so much that you can share with it as well. So really looking forward to it. Guys, if you want to check out Anja, check out LinkedIn. Her links will be in the description box below, but that's Anja van Beek, and human and talent-centered strategist and HR and leadership expert. Anja, thank you so much. Thanks for chatting to me, and I will chat to you soon.
Thanks, Kevin. Goodbye.
Bye.